Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our PRI webinar on the Southern California wildfires. I'm Tim Anaya, PRI's Vice President of Marketing and Communications, and we're thrilled to have you here for today's webinar. We have three really great experts here today, all of whom have deep expertise in policy and policy making in their respective fields, and they're going to share their thoughts on how did we get here, how the right reforms really can help people rebuild faster and better. Now, it won't be just us talking today. We want to get your questions as well. So if you're tuning in on Zoom today, if you could share your questions in the Zoom Q&A box, which is somewhere around there in the middle of your screen, I'll moderate those and I'll ask some of your questions later in our webinar. So as we begin today, I want to kind of set the stage for where we were. As of this taping on March 12th, the Palisades fire, which started on January 7th, it has destroyed, staggering to think this, 6,837 residential and commercial structures. Another 973 were damaged, and we had 12 confirmed fatalities. Now, the Eaton fire that destroyed parts of Altadena and the Pasadena area near PRI's headquarters destroyed 9,414 residential and commercial structures, according to CAL FIRE. And it damaged another 1,074, and unfortunately, there were another 17 confirmed fatalities. Now, I was actually down in Southern California the morning of January 7th. My colleague Lance Izumi and I, we were in town to film a documentary that PRI is working on, and we had some time to kill before the filming, so we thought, well, let's just go to Venice and go along the boardwalk and find a coffee shop to kill time in. And as we walked there around 10 a.m. that morning, it was a beautiful Southern California day, windy, of course. And then, not 45 minutes later, we saw this strange brown cloud outside the window, and we walked outside. And sure enough, where it was a beautiful sunny day, now you saw a major conflagration where, and it had traveled that 7 miles roughly from the Palisades area to Venice in that short amount of time. So I guess that's, what people mean when they say something spread like wildfires. So today we're going to talk about how bad policies made an incredibly destructive wildfire worse, but we also want to spend a lot of our time really talking about what we can do to make things better going forward. How would good reforms make the rebuilding process faster and easier? And so with us today, we have, as I mentioned, three of the best. We have our PRI board member and the chair of PRI's California Reform Committee, the Honorable Dan Kolkey. Dan, if you're not familiar with his work, he's a retired California Court of Appeal justice. He's a former counsel to Governor of California when Governor Wilson was in office, and he's a retired partner in the San Francisco office of Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher. Then we have our Stephen Greenhut, who's the director of PRI's Free Cities Center. He's a longtime journalist who's covered California politics and policy since 1998. When he's not doing PRI work, he's the Western Region Director for the R Street Institute, and he's on the editorial board of the Southern California News Group. And then finally, we have our friend Joe Kent from PRI's sister free market think tank in Hawaii, the Grassroot Institute. And Joe is going to share with us the experiences that his fellow Hawaiians had in the destructive Maui wildfires, kind of eerily similar to what folks in Southern California went through. And he has some lessons for Southern Californians of, what folks went through there as the rebuilding begins. So we're thrilled to have all of you here for this discussion. And I thought as we started, we could look back a little bit with a question about what happened. So, for each of you, looking at the Southern California wildfires from your individual perspectives, what would you say was maybe the policy mistake that had the biggest impact on the fires? Let's start with Dan.
All right. So I would say that the biggest policy problem underlying all of this is a lack of funding for wildfire resilience and forest resilience. The fact of the matter is that some of the most destructive fires in California history have occurred in what's called the wildland-urban interface. And that is the interface where human development meets underdeveloped wildland. And where are those locations? Well, the campfire that destroyed the town of Paradise was in that wildland-urban interface. The Palisades fire was in that interface. The Santa Monica Mountains go down to the Palisades. And the Eden fire was within the wildland-urban interface. The San Gabriel Mountains go into the San Gabriel Valley, where Altadena is. So failing to have sufficient funding to provide forest resilience and wildland resilience, to me, is one of the key problems that resulted in these fires. And I might just add one more thing, and then I will stop. After former Governor Jerry Brown had experienced 8 of some of California's largest wildfires, he put together a group of experts that issued what was called the Venado Declaration. And it basically proposed that the state of California spend about $5 billion annually on wildfire and forest resilience. California, as I'll get to at a later point, hasn't come even close to achieving that. So underfunding to me is a significant problem and reason for the problems that the state has with respect to wildfires.
Steve, question to you. What do you think was the biggest policy mistake?
Yeah, it's a hard one actually, because it's our policies is like this giant hairball, right? Where you can't really unravel the whole thing, because we just have one after another regulation built up at the local and state level over all these years. And when I actually testified in Congress about the California wildfires and talked about how we have a tangled web of regulation, and it makes our state incapable of doing anything. And I put some of the blame on our climate change agenda, which we spend an awful lot. What is it, 40-some billion dollars over several years? But it seems designed to try to change the entire planet's climate rather than make our state, which only contributes maybe less than 1% of all the global emissions, instead of making our state resilient in the face of whatever climate, whatever Mother Nature throws our way. So I think that we focused on this one thing because, like Dan said, we need a lot of money to fund some of these basic infrastructure and wildland clearance projects. We're spending the money. We obviously have the money. We're just spending it in the wrong way because of this kind of ideological focus rather than a nuts and bolts focus. So I guess that's one thing. But if I had to pick one specific thing, it would be CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, which probably is that's the impediment that comes up time and time again on everything from these clearance projects to these hardening projects to rebuilding. So the climate change focus, and then specifically CEQA as an impediment.
Joe, your thoughts?
Well, looking from afar, I think about the water tanks that were empty. I read in the news stories, and that I think led to the water pressure not being available for firefighters. Interestingly, in Maui, a very similar thing happened. There's controversy over a water tank that couldn't be used to fight the fires, but also the water pressure dropped as well. At the same time, firefighters on Maui in the Lahaina fires were responding to other things, and so there weren't as many firefighters available. And that's a similar thing that happened in Palisades. I am told that the firefighters, some of them were sent home on the morning of the fires. And so a lot of people debate, does government do too much and so on? But a lot of people would agree that the one thing the government should do is emergency preparation. And so to Steve's point, just better preparation overall would help.
So Dan, as I've argued in my book, The California Left Coast Survivors Guide, what Gavin Newsom calls the California way, and that's all the policies and the attitudes espoused by officials like him that want to dictate how you live your life according to their values and worldview. It didn't start the fire, but they're going to make the rebuilding and the recovery processes that much more difficult. Now, you recently published a really terrific op-ed in the Orange County Register and the Southern California News Group newspapers, highlighting some of these misguided policies that really set the stage for what became a major catastrophe. Can you share with our viewers today, how misguided policies by Governor Newsom and many of the other Southern California political leaders on issues like, as Steve was pointing out, climate change really set the stage for this disaster that we saw and made, sadly, the destruction and the pain experienced so much more than it needed to be if we had reasonable policies in place.
Well, that's exactly right. And Steve, hit the nail on the head when he talked about the fact that we have wrongly prioritized funding for climate change policies in an effort to basically stop climate change rather than dealing with the consequences of climate change, like wildfires and drought. And apropos of that is I looked at the state budgets under Gavin Newsom, and in fact, 8 of the most destructive fires in California history and 9 of the largest wildfires in California history have taken place since Gavin Newsom took office. And if you look at the budgets, and what I'm going to cite is according to the Legislative Analyst, which is a nonpartisan office, they determined that California over the past 4 fiscal years, going up to the current fiscal year, which is 24-25, over those 4 fiscal years, the state was budgeting $2.6 billion for wildfire and forest resilience, $2.6 billion. Now, remember the Venado Declaration that Jerry Brown developed with these experts proposed $5 billion a year. So the state over 4 years, $2.6 billion, but it is allocating $9.2 billion for zero emission vehicles. So you've got $9.2 billion over 4 fiscal years going to zero emission vehicles, but only $2.6 billion going to wildfire and forest resilience. So almost 3.5 times more revenue is allocated to zero emission vehicles than to saving lives and homes with wildfire and forest resilience. And the fact of the matter, not only is it questionable whether or not what California is doing is going to reduce climate change, but the wildfires themselves have neutralized any kind of reduction in greenhouse gases by reason of zero emission vehicles. Specifically, a study by UCLA and the University of Chicago found that the 2020 wildfires alone spewed twice the reduction of greenhouse gases that California had achieved over 18 years. So let me say that again, twice the amount of greenhouse gases that California had achieved over 18 years was undone by the 2020 wildfires. And then the 2017 wildfires, the 2018 wildfires had more than double the amount of greenhouse gases that were reduced in 2017. So the climate change policy is self-defeating if you're not addressing wildfires that generate all this carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases. Further, they destroy forests that act as a sink to carbon dioxide emissions into the atmosphere. So to save time for everyone else, I just leave it at that for now.
Steve, going off of Dan's excellent points there, infrastructure failings of all types were a factor in the wildfire's destructiveness. And the problems, as Joe pointed out, with the region's water infrastructure really made the wildfires that much worse, especially in those initial hours and days. You've written extensively about California's water challenges in your excellent book, Winning the Water Wars. Share your thoughts on how inadequate or ineffective water infrastructure really made the wildfires worse, and Why does this region have substandard infrastructure despite all the tens of billions that we've spent or committed to various infrastructure projects over the years?
Yeah, I mean, water infrastructure, it's a huge problem overall in the state. We haven't built any significant water infrastructure, maybe one reservoir since the 70s, when the population was about half what it is right now. And that's just led to this constant pushing for rationing and conservation. Even though 50% of the state's water flows out to the Pacific, 40% is for ag and 10% is for urban uses. A total of 5.7% is for residences. So obviously stopping me from washing my car on the weekend is not going to make an enormous dent. But that said, water is tangential to the fires. I mean, we're going to have wildfires no matter what. I mean, but it would have helped mitigate some of the drought situations and made water more available, for firefighting. So I'm looking here at a LA Times article about the Santa Ynez Reservoir. It says it was built to save Pacific Palisades. It was empty when the flames came. Here's a case of, why are they doing maintenance in January and shutting the reservoir? So the state doesn't do a very good job managing any of it. I mean, I was up at Lake Oroville when the spillways were in danger of collapsing. The state, we built a lot of these major and important infrastructure projects in the past, and then it doesn't do a good job, despite our enormous budget, taking care of it. But here, this is just a quote from the article. Former and current Department of Water Power officials acknowledge that if the reservoir had held water, higher elevation areas of the Palisades would have had more water pressure. So that certainly could have helped. Another Times article I see, and this isn't, it says LA Fire Department did not alert DWP to more than 1,000 fire hydrants that were needing repair. Now, some of these things aren't really infrastructure as much as government management. But the fact is, we have not prioritized the nuts and bolts infrastructure that would make us resilient in the face of wildfires, in the face of droughts. And at one point that a water official made to me was that the state makes it very difficult for agencies, the AQMD, water agencies, to bring online natural gas generators. And those generators help move water around to the places that they're needed. So that's just one simple example of this miasma of regulation that I talked about before that restricts our state's ability just to do the most fundamental things that it ought to be doing. And water, it's just something we're just not doing. I mean, Governor Newsom had backed the tunnel project, which would, but the San Joaquin Delta, Sacramento Delta tunnels that would keep the water flowing south of the Delta. And yet, where are we on this? I mean, it was reduced to a single tunnel. It's somewhat controversial project up here in Northern California, but nothing ever gets done. And Sites Reservoir has been on the books for how many decades? So we're just not prioritizing the things we ought to be prioritizing, and water infrastructure ought to be one of those things.
So, Joe, when you hear all this, and when you've watched, what's happened, in January, you probably had a sense of deja vu seeing this because your neighbors in Lahaina experienced equally destructive wildfires back in August of 2023. Now, we know, of course, that Maui is a very popular vacation spot for many Californians. So, thought maybe we could help start the discussion here by give us a little bit of reminder of the extent of the damage that you all experienced and the loss of life, and some of the similarities that you see and differences between what Maui experienced and what Southern California did.
Yeah, well, I was a public school teacher in Lahaina. King Kamehameha Third Elementary School is right next to this big banyan tree. Anyone who goes to Lahaina remembers this big banyan tree. It's one of the most impressive banyan trees in the world, I'd say. And so when I saw, now I work at the Grassroot Institute, and when I saw the pictures in the morning of the fire next to that banyan tree, for the fire to get there, I thought the whole town has to be burned down. And that's exactly what happened. The town burned so fast and so furious, the news didn't even know what happened. The government, the local county didn't even know what happened. The mayor didn't know what happened. And until the next morning when it was all burned down. And, there were 102 people that lost their lives there. 12,000 people were displaced. That's 3,000 structures. Already 400, 500 people, could be even more, have left the island. It's going to be billions of dollars. Estimates are around 7 billion to 12 billion to recover. And so this was, the biggest disaster, certainly in Hawaii, natural disaster, but definitely compares nationwide as well. And, I'm just having flashbacks here about Stephen was talking about water and preparedness. And those are all the same issues that we're talking about. After the fires, it's almost like the stages of grief that happen. You've got disbelief, and depression, and eventually comes the anger. And there was definitely a lot of anger felt in the community. Now we're more than a year out from the fire, and I think there's healing, but there's still a question about and fear, I think, about what if it happens again? What are we doing to mitigate against this? Have we learned our lessons, and so on? And those lessons are about preparedness, and all of the different policies that get in the way.
Let's turn to the rebuilding and recovery process and all the issues associated with that. Mayor Bass made a big show about, we're opening these one-stop centers in the city, right, where you can get all of the, deal with all the bureaucracy in one place. But that's great that there's a one-stop center, but apparently there's still 12 or more state and local bureaucracies that you have to contend with when you go to these one-stop centers. So, yeah, it's nice to go to only one place, but you'd think the city would have done just as much to try to cut some of this bureaucracy. Dan, question to you. And we're getting a lot of questions from our viewers about kind of how do you deal with some of this bureaucracy. You've written a lot over the years, certainly about how governors can use their executive powers for good to waive a lot of this unnecessary bureaucracy, especially in times of crisis like this. What do you make of what Governor Newsom has done recently to waive some of the CEQA requirements in the rebuilding process? And how should governor and the mayor use their executive powers, to their fullest to speed up rebuilding? And on top of that, we're getting questions from some of here's one here, how do we get local officials to waive? Apparently, Southern California Air Quality Management District has, they're being allowed to deny prescriptive burn permits. How can we get the Trump administration to intervene in some of these mandates? So maybe address what can elected officials do with their executive powers, but also maybe you have some thoughts or ideas for our listeners of what can they do to get, some action to reduce some of this bureaucracy?
Well, let me start with the governor, since I do have a fair amount of experience and knowledge with respect to the governor's emergency powers when I was in the governor's office as his counsel to Governor Wilson. So the government code, section 8558, does give the governor the ability to call a state of emergency whenever there are conditions of disaster or extreme peril to the safety of persons and property. And that's certainly the case with wildfires. And this allows the governor to suspend any regulatory statute or any regulation that strict compliance with which would impede or delay addressing the emergency. So Governor Newsom did, after a few days following the fires, did issue a proper executive order that basically suspended CEQA with respect to rebuilding, suspended permits being required from the Coastal Commission as long as the rebuilt house was basically in the same location, same dimensions as before. and asked for a state agency to determine which building codes should be complied with respect to the rebuilding. So he's done some of what any governor would do in this situation. What I think, and maybe he's doing this behind the scenes, is he's got to quickly determine, which building codes have to be complied with. I mean, a lot of these homes probably were built well before more expensive building codes were implemented. And he's got to decide, well, am I going to require the most recent building codes to be complied with, which will be more expensive, or just allow the home to be rebuilt with the building codes as it was when it was built, with the authority, if you want to upgrade and pay more, to do it. So, I mean, he's got to make a lot of decisions like this and get that done quickly. The other thing is he's got to figure out a way to speed up the proceeds from insurance companies to help with the rebuilding process. I have thought that there's probably a way for the state to advance funds for those who are insured and then subrogate to the insured's right to recover. In other words, the state would advance it, but then would have a right to go against the insurance company to recover what the state has advanced. The state ought to be talking with the construction industry to see what the resources are and whether or not the state needs to offer incentives for construction industries in other states to come and help with the rebuilding process, because presumably California doesn't have enough construction resources to do all of this at once. So, there are plenty of things that he can do with the emergency powers. I think he should be doing more. In terms of the Trump administration, I would simply say that it was absolutely foolish on Newsom's part to be proceeding with a special session to quote unquote Trump-proof California at the same time that he's begging Trump to provide funding to California. I mean, talk about a diplomatic snafu by a governor. Should know better that this special session that was proceeding after the election and then even during the wildfires, that special session was not going to do anything, really. As I understand it, at most, it authorized maybe $50 million more for the Attorney General's office, when the Attorney General is in the middle of a fiscal budget and had plenty of money for whatever litigation the Attorney General wanted to do. And so this was all virtue signaling and image creation by Newsom at the risk and cost of alienating Trump and getting more funds from the federal government. So that was completely mishandled.
So, Steve, obviously CEQA and California's housing laws are going to play a big role in the rebuilding process. And not surprisingly, we've seen a lot of chatter, from the governor, right, that he wants to reimagine the Palisades. And so, yes, he's issued some executive orders in this area too, particularly about, buying lots in the Palisades area. You write extensively about housing policy for PRI's Free Cities Center. Talk about some of these issues and how are, all these issues of housing policy and zoning and density, how are they going to play a role in the rebuilding process?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this does always end up back at CEQA, which is, was passed in 1970, and everyone in the Capitol knows that it's an impediment even to the projects that they most want to have built. And I was looking at some research that showed that what it was. This was at our PRI Sacramento event, that about half of the projects that are subject to a CEQA lawsuit are environmentally friendly projects. So everyone knows that it needs to be reformed, everyone in the Capitol, but they never reform it. They exempt different projects on a piecemeal basis. When Mayor Darrell Steinberg in Sacramento wanted to build the Kings Arena, of course, they immediately exempted CEQA requirements. But we can't ever seem to exempt them. Just reform the bill and not just pick winners and losers. And I just don't know why. Like Dan pointed to all these special sessions. I mean, the governor had a special session on gas price gouging. Well, this was before the fire, but all of these problems are ones that have been well known for a long time. But I want to point to on that along that line, one of the problems is the permitting process and the Assembly, California Assembly Select Committee on Permit Reform. They did a final report, was just released last week. It's a good report. I'll just quote quickly from a section of it. Collectively, the result of our failed approach to permitting is an anemic level of construction for the projects necessary to address our housing and climate crises. The result is higher costs for housing, electricity, transportation, and even insurance. While permitting is but one aspect of a project's success, it plays an outside role. And it noted that builders face permitting processes that are time-consuming, opaque, confusing, and favor process over outcome. So even the California Assembly Democrats recognize this. The question is, why don't we do anything about it? And that I just don't have an answer. I mean, I like the fact that Governor Newsom passed these executive orders that streamline, that exempt the Coastal Act for rebuilding, but we need this statewide. And why does it have to take a massive disaster to get some of these reforms, even temporary reforms that we need?
And it's also too a question of it's action versus words.
Right.
Not only is he putting in the various executive orders, is his administration actually giving the people in the community the relief they're seeking?
Yeah, and like that report, that was a good report, and I don't want to criticize the head of the committee, Buffy Wicks, but okay, great, these are good directives, but how is it going to actually get implemented at the local and state level? How are we going to actually fix this and not just set up these nice and correct overviews of what's wrong? We need some specific reforms of the laws that are impeding progress.
So, Joe, as we mentioned earlier, it's been about a year and a half since the Maui wildfires, and you have the advantage of a little bit of hindsight now. You've seen many families and businesses who lost their homes and shops and restaurants and such, sorting through a lot of these issues, like, clearing the debris from their properties and, working with architects and contractors. So, what's been the experience of Maui residents that can offer a preview or hopefully not a warning of what's to come for Southern Californians that are starting to go through the rebuilding? And what are some of the things based on Maui's experience that they should be on the lookout for or wary of as they begin to pick up the pieces?
Well, I always think that government officials are typically about a year behind what the public sentiment is. And in Maui, government officials were still operating under the political thought that relaxing home building it would be, politically unpopular. Meanwhile, you have all of these people, a flood of people who are trying desperately to rebuild their homes. Now it's a year later, and thankfully they finally issued some waivers and wiggle room to allow people to get past these sort of permitting rules and shoreline rules and things. But many of the rules are still there. I mean, California and Maui have some of the most housing regulations in the nation. I mean, there are 6 layers of housing regulations. These are like departments, actually 7 if you count the State Water Commission. It's a huge amount of layers. It takes around 10 years typically in Hawaii for somebody just to get approval to build a home. And so now what they've done in Hawaii on Maui is the governor issued a series of waivers and said basically you can build your home in the special management area regions, which are kind of near the ocean and so on. So that has helped. They've also set up a private permitting office. There's a law in Hawaii that says you can't privatize anything that's typically done by a government worker. And so they waived that law just for this one little permitting office. And that's allowed around 300 permits to be issued so far. Around a dozen homes have been rebuilt. So that's good, but it's slow. I mean, again, we're more a year and a half now past the fires, and many people are still stuck in the permitting process. One thing that's hanging up a lot of people is they allowed everyone to rebuild what they had, but if somebody adds, let's say, a bathroom to their home or another section to their home, the permit is disallowed. And so, let's give some flexibility here. These people have had their lives turned upside down. We shouldn't be so stringent. So that's a big warning during the rebuilding process. The government should think ahead of the public sentiment, not behind.
Right. I think, that as long as the government says, look, you can basically have the same footprint that you had for your home. We're not going to determine, how many bathrooms you have and so on. If it's a slightly larger footprint, we'll give you some leeway and you can do it without any permits. I mean, but they can certainly develop, what the dimensions are that can be expanded without having to have a permit under these circumstances.
Yep.
So, Steve, insurance, of course, plays a big role in the wildfire recovery effort. And, any Californian knows we're in the midst of a pretty big insurance crisis. It's growing worse by the day. And even Californians who don't live in wildfire-prone areas are fearing losing their home coverage when their next renewal is up. And you've written and covered this issue extensively. So maybe you could give us share your thoughts a little bit on, kind of how did we get here in the first place with our insurance problems, and then, kind of look to what are elected officials, talking about here, and are the ideas that they're kicking around. Is that going to solve the problem and give peace of mind not only to wildfire victims but all Californians?
Yeah, the latest iteration of our insurance crisis has been going on for several years, and that's one of the frustrations I've had. It's been, I don't know, 3 years or so where I wrote about California's coming insurance crisis. Everyone knows about it. It's not like particularly prescient. Insurers have been leaving and threatening to leave, and the problems go back to Proposition 103 in 1988. In the midst of rapidly rising insurance rates, voters approved a prior approval insurance system and made the insurance commissioner an elected position. And then the insurance commissioner would have to approve and could even roll back rates. And so it's a price control system. And Tim, you've spent all your years in the legislature. Have you ever met an elected official who wants to be known as the person who approved large rate hikes? It's not going to happen.
That's a big no. Actually.
Right. And the insurance commissioner, do you know any insurance commissioners who really are super excited about insurance? It's often something they perceive to be a stepping stone to higher office. So we created this incentive structure and this price control system. Now, the real reason for the rising insurance rates was a California Supreme Court decision, the Royal Globe decision, which allowed these third-party lawsuits. So it was driven by litigation, but voters maybe don't know what the real cause is, and they wanted rate relief. So we've been stuck with this system, but there are a lot of things that could be done within the confines of the Prop 103 system without having to go back to voters and change it, although I do think it would be a good idea if someone did that. And finally, after a wave of bad wildfires in 2020, and State Farm, the largest property insurer in the state, they're like 21% of policies announced, I think it's been 2 years ago, that they were going to stop writing new policies. And so that, sparked a problem because we need more people writing insurance. And of course, in a free market system, the prices rise and then more people get involved and we have competition and it drives them down again. Instead, we have this price control. So Ricardo Lara, the current insurance commissioner, he actually came up with I'd say it's a really solid package of insurance reforms, basically fast tracking the rate approval process, allowing insurers to consider reinsurance, the insurance that insurance companies buy. And the more they have, the more policies they're able to write, allowing them to include the price of rising reinsurance in their policies. There was some rejiggering of how the FAIR plan is backed up. That's the insurer of last resort that's backed by the insurance companies, but was created by the state. But then it took so long. I don't know why there was this delay. And then finally, as these were going into effect, we got these wildfires, which of course are going to create additional stress on the system. And then Laura has, he's done different things that are bad too, denied rate increases, and you basically put a moratorium on non-renewal. So anyway, but still, generally speaking, the insurance industry was happy with the way these insurance reforms are going. And I just saw something where a few insurers are willing to increase their underwriting in California. So I think once the smoke clears, literally, we'll see where that's working.
Dan, you've worked on a lot of insurance issues, throughout your legal career. What are your thoughts on, how insurance is contributing to all this?
So I agree with everything that Stephen has said about Prop 103. Let me add a couple of those additional points, or at least emphasize a couple of points. One is, before Proposition 103, California had an insurance commissioner, but the insurance commissioner was appointed. And the problem with having an elected insurance commissioner, as I think Stephen, indicated, is that the insurance commissioner has every incentive in order to be liked by the public to keep rates down. I mean, that's how, the public says, oh, well, this is a good or a bad insurance commissioner because he or she is keeping rates down. But the problem is, if the rates are kept too low and the insurance commissioner is too tough, the insurance companies can't really make sufficient profit to make it worthwhile to take the risk that they take in the state. So, that is a problem. And before, when we had an insurance commissioner, the governor, I believe, appointed him or her. So the governor was ultimately responsible for what happened with respect to the insurance commissioner, but the insurance commissioner was at least separated directly from having to appeal by the public by saying, look how low I've kept your rates, while forgetting the fact that those low rates are going to undermine the market and rates generally, as insurance companies refuse to basically take on new customers. The other point, I think, that's very relevant to the insurance crisis is that until the state starts having better policies taking care of the disasters that give rise to the insurance claims, like wildfires, this is going to be a very expensive state for insurance companies to do business in, because they're always having to basically pay out large sums based on large disasters covering a large number of people. So number one thing for the state to do is to start getting its arms around reducing the risk of these disasters. Some you can't reduce the risk of, like earthquakes, other than through building codes. But wildfires is something that you can reduce the risk by better policies through forest resilience, thinning forests, getting rid of dead shrubs, prescribed burns. There's all kinds of things that you can do to reduce the magnitude of disasters that would then bring down the costs of insurance.
A reminder for all of our attendees, if you have questions for the experts, please submit them in the Zoom Q&A function, and I'll be asking your questions in the last few minutes of our webinar. Joe, what has been the experience of Maui residents with insurance in the wildfires aftermath? How quickly were they, or have they yet, received the payouts from the insurance companies? And how did wildfires impact Hawaii's insurance market?
Well, this sounds like the same recipe as, I'm getting flashbacks basically. To Dan's point, it was interesting. There was a man in Lahaina, his name is Joe Pluta, and he would go around advocating for firehouses. Like, let's build a firehouse. so that we can better protect our town and bring down our insurance rates. And what he argued is that if we self-fund these firehouses, then we'll save a lot on the insurance payments. So why not just like make an advance payment on that? Unfortunately, his firehouse did not get built, and his home was burned in the fire. He actually told me he leaped from his bathroom window to escape the flames. Now they're trying to build the firehouses, but it's kind of interesting that, to Dan's point, mitigating against risk actually is a way to bring down insurance rates. Now, it's interesting because there are three big players in the cost side. You've got the insurance companies, in Hawaii, the electric companies that have been blamed for the fires, for sparking the fires, and the government. And they're all, basically in a big lawsuit with each other. But it almost doesn't matter who wins, because at the end of the day, the regular person, the homeowner, is going to pay for any costs of this. And in the meantime, just like you guys mentioned, the insurance commissioner has a pressure, even in Hawaii, to keep those rates low. And so Hawaii is not a great environment for insurance companies. We need more competition, but we're extinguishing those companies from the state.
So as we, in our final minutes here, let's focus on reforms, and we have some listener questions and comments kind of along these points. So first to Dan, we build today as really focusing on the future, the reforms needed to help the people of the Palisades and Altadena quickly review, but also to ensure, right, that the state's better prepared to withstand future wildfires and really prevent them altogether. We have a comment here from Jason, who points out, it's worthwhile to discuss the impacts of rulings by groups like the Coastal Commission. He points out in 2019, the Coastal Commission literally fined LADWP, the Department of Water and Power, $2 million and stopped work LADWP was doing in the upland areas near the Palisades to reduce wildfire risk. And as we know, that had tragic consequences. So, based on your experience and your research, what are one or two key reforms that you believe the legislature should enact, or maybe it's a thing a governor could do by executive order, that would really achieve this goal of reducing wildfire risk going forward?
Well, what we haven't mentioned is that this month, Gavin Newsom, I believe, just to show he's trying to do something despite the disaster in Los Angeles, issued another executive order that tries to provide for healthy forests and resilience by lifting CEQA and other impediments to doing things to thin forests, get rid of shrubs, and so on. But to do that, so he's lifted some of the impediments that Stephen has mentioned in terms of getting things done like CEQA. But you're not going to get it done just by lifting CEQA and all these impediments unless you've got the funding to do this. So number one, the legislature needs to start shifting like this $9.2 billion that's going to zero emission vehicles and move it to funding forest resilience, wildfire resilience, and so on. That's number one. Number two, at least 6 of the most destructive fires in California since 2015 have been sparked by utility power lines that have been downed in bad weather and heavy winds. But it is very expensive to either put these lines underground, as PG&E is doing, or at least insulate the transmission lines. And putting them underground is very expensive, very slow. It's going to take well over a decade, maybe 2 decades, for PG&E to put most of its transmission lines underground, and it's very expensive. And where's this money going to come from? As it is, electricity bills in California are much higher than the national average. And so given that, the legislature ought to relax the greenhouse gas reduction requirements placed on utilities, which make electricity more expensive for the public, relax those so that the funds can be used to basically either insulate or underground these transmission lines, which reduce the risk of wildfires. And I'll add a third one is let's provide tax incentives to homeowners in the wildland urban interface to upgrade their homes with fire resistant materials. I mean, fire resistant materials do work when you upgrade your homes in that fashion. And just some homes with fire resistant material can actually benefit the entire community because it stops the fire from spreading further as well. So that's another thing. And then because the governor can't always keep issuing executive orders, lifting CEQA and so on, there's also other requirements like this Forest Practice Act, which also requires permits before having controlled burns and so on. And the whole approval process needs to be expedited. I mean, it can take 2 to 3 approvals for controlled burns on California state lands, an air permit, a smoke management plan, and occasionally approval from Cal Fire. The legislature ought to start working to expedite this process. One last example, and then I'll give the floor to someone else, is that after the disastrous Camp Fire in 2018 that destroyed the town of Paradise, the area tried to rebuild and applied for a permit to help them clear the forested area in their wildland urban interface. They finally got approval 2 years later, and 4 days after that, there was the Northern Complex fire that destroyed everything that had been built. So clearly, the process of getting these permits is taking too long when you see what happened to the poor people in the area of the town of Paradise.
Steve, your thoughts on what can we do in the water and infrastructure area? Jason has another good point here, following up on what you said about the Santa Ynez Reservoir. You know, he said that reservoir had been out of service for about a year, and the city contracting process had taken so long to find and approve contractor to remember it was your approving or improving repairing a tear in the reservoir's liner that they just simply emptied it and let it sit unused. So what are your thoughts? You know, what can we do going forward to make sure we don't have these types of infrastructure failures?
If I could just interject for a minute, Tim, in fact, it was a state agency that ordered the water drained from the reservoir on the grounds it was concerned it might be contaminated.
That's incredible. I mean, I was out during the last Jerry Brown drought, not blaming Jerry Brown. It just was under his watch. I went out to the New Melones reservoir where they were state and feds were largely emptying it to save a dozen or so hatchery raised fish. So maybe we can figure out how to stop some of that insanity. The state passed a water bond in 2014, and yet none of the actual I don't think any of the actual water infrastructure projects have been built. A lot of it just went to environmental related projects. I want to point out also quickly this Newsweek article goes back to the listener's question, where the California Coastal Commission fined LADWP $1.9 million for a utility pole project. They were installing metal utility poles to stop fires, and they were fined because of the impact on some sort of endangered weed, the Bronton's milk vetch. That kind of stuff just seems insane. And then on just one unrelated change, Ricardo Lara, the insurance commissioner, just announced, just reading this piece, that he wants to look at the way interveners are paid in the insurance process. And those are the folks who basically are paid to oppose rate increases. And that's a really good point. That's very important. I mean, the Prop 103 calls for interveners, but the state has a lot of latitude to decide whether they actually added value and how much they should be paid. And if the state looks at that closely and limits how many millions of dollars they're paying out, maybe there'll be less incentive to gum up the work. So those are the things that. Oh, and one last thing. There's the Tahoe Donner subdivision in Truckee is an example of a private homeowners association that follows all these fire-wise standards, and people who live there agree to allow inspections and all sorts of fire clearance things. I think we need allow property rights to work and come up with these kind of fixes so that people can harden their own properties. And I think they'll do a better job than a private association than city. So those are my points.
So our last question here in the last few minutes that we have, and I think this might be a good one for Joe as we end. We got a question from a viewer today. He unfortunately lost his home in the Altadena fire. And he said he's been really frustrated to see, the types of things we've discussed today, right? From a Governor Wilson or Governor Newsom and some of the local officials. They say they're committed to the right reforms, but again, actions speak louder than words. And it raises a good point. Obviously, right, politicians are going to say a lot of good things before the cameras, but the spotlight is soon going to fade away. So, what advice do you have for the people of the Palisades and Altadena? What can they do at the grassroots level? Um, these are regular folks trying to rebuild. What can they do at the grassroots level to really make sure that the help they're promised is delivered, to make sure that promise is made or promise is kept?
Well, they say that only a crisis can inspire change. It's kind of unfortunate that that's true, but it is true, and it has been true in Hawaii. The crisis of Lahaina has spurred a lot of lawmakers to be more open to relaxing the rules. Now, I think they haven't relaxed it enough. And if I go back in time to the 90s on Kauai, Hurricane Iniki destroyed 2,000 homes, the same number of homes that were destroyed in Lahaina. And those homes were rebuilt in 1 year. I think it's because people just ignored the government back then. They just rebuilt, and I really believe in the power of the spontaneous order of individuals, people just rolling up their sleeves. People ask, who's going to rebuild Lahaina? People are wanting, there's so much incentive and money out there to rebuild Lahaina from individuals. And the government, as much as possible, should get out of the way. We've seen so many stories on Maui of nonprofits who, I know a minister who is trying to build, 10 homes on his property. And the government blew the whistle and said, no, you have to stop. And there are many, many other stories of that, of private builders, nonprofits who are not making money on this, who have been told to stop. And so, my big lesson is get out of the way and let people rebuild.
Well, on that point, I want to thank all our great experts, Dan and Steve and Joe. And by the way, congratulations to new grandpa, Steve.
Thank you.
This is your first grandchild.
My first one, yes.
So thank you all for tuning in. And if you're going to be in Northern California, we hope you'll join us. We're going to have a great event April 4th, 5th, and 6th, our Napa Valley retreat featuring Steve Forbes, the speaker at the Saturday night dinner, and a whole bunch of other great speakers, Nathan Hochman, the district attorney of LA, Steve Hilton, many other, Congressman Kevin Kiley, many other interesting folks. So go to pacificresearch.org/events to get all the information about that and to sign up to join us. So thank you again for your time.